200 wedding guests were laughing at Abigail Carter from the other side of the kitchen door. But why was the cowboy groom suddenly walking away from his own table? Bless her heart, Charlotte's voice carried through the wall as laughter rattled the glassware. Abigail stood frozen beside the cold stove, flour still caught in her knuckles. Then she untied her apron, wrapped her knives, and reached for her mother's cast-iron skillet. The door opened. Stay with Abigail's story and tell us where you're watching from. Rain had a way of finding the same weak place in Abigail Carter's roof. It came through above the back bedroom, slipped between two warped boards, and struck the bottom of a tin bucket with a slow, hollow tap. Abigail lay awake, listening. 6 years earlier, Daniel would have climbed onto the roof before breakfast and patched it himself. 6 years earlier, there had been 2 pairs of hands for 40 acres of Wyoming ground. Now there was one. By daylight, Abigail was already outside. She fed the hens, checked the garden fence, and replaced a loose staple where the south pasture met the wagon road. Her hands had grown rough since Daniel died. They were good hands, though. They could mend wire, knead bread, dress a chicken, turn a pie crust thin enough to see light through it. What they could not do was make money appear. The letter came that afternoon. Walker Ranch required an experienced cook for the wedding of Ethan Walker and Charlotte Beaumont on July 14th. More than 200 guests were expected. 6 weeks of preparation would begin in May. Payment, $40. Abigail read that figure twice. $40 meant the mortgage note could be brought current. $40 meant roofing tin. $40 meant Daniel's land stayed Carter land. She accepted before sunset. On the first Monday in May, Abigail drove toward Walker Ranch with her knives wrapped in clean cloth beside her, her mother's cast-iron skillet packed in straw, and one carpetbag containing nearly everything else she needed. The ranch appeared beyond a long cottonwood-lined road, its buildings spread beneath the pale Wyoming foothills. Corrals stood east of the house. Beyond them, cattle moved across open grass darkened by spring rain. The kitchen surprised her. 2 wood-burning ranges, a broad stone hearth, deep sinks supplied from a hand pump, shelves strong enough for flour barrels. Beneath the floor, a cold cellar smelled of earth, apples, and old brine. Abigail ran one hand across the long work table. For the first time in months, she forgot about money. Then Charlotte Beaumont entered. She was tall and carefully dressed, with gloves too fine for ranch work and a traveling suit Abigail guessed had come from St. Louis. "You're Mrs. Carter?" "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte examined the kitchen before looking at Abigail again. "There is one condition I prefer to make clear myself. During the celebration, you will remain here. Guests are not to find you in the dining rooms, parlor, or reception areas." Abigail waited. Charlotte's eyes traveled briefly over her figure before returning to her face. "The wedding will be photographed and discussed. Everything must present properly." There it was. Abigail had known that look since she was young enough to understand when people were judging her without saying the words. She folded the Walker letter once and slipped it into her apron pocket. "I understand." "Good." Charlotte left. Abigail stood still until her footsteps disappeared. Then she opened a flour barrel. By the end of the first week, the kitchen belonged to Abigail in every way that mattered. Stock simmered before sunrise. Hams cured in the smokehouse. Fruit preserves cooled in neat rows. She tested pastry, calculated portions, and filled several sheets of paper with measurements for a 4-tier wedding cake. Work had rules. That was why she trusted it. The unexpected thing happened during her second week. It was barely 5 in the morning when the back door opened. A tall man stepped inside wearing a faded work shirt, dusty trousers, and boots marked with dried mud. Early silver showed at his temples. He stopped when he saw her. "Morning." "Morning." Abigail kept kneading. "Can I help you?" "Coffee, if I'm not trespassing." She glanced around his kitchen. That almost made her smile. "You're Mr. Walker." "Ethan." He poured himself a cup, then hesitated beside the table. "Will I be in your way?" That question made Abigail look at him properly. "No." He sat at the far end. He did not stare. He did not give instructions. For 20 minutes he drank coffee while Abigail worked. The next morning, he returned. Then the next. Soon Abigail began leaving enough coffee for two without admitting to herself why. One morning, Ethan watched her add vinegar to pastry dough. What does that do? Keeps the crust tender. Another morning, he picked up a finished loaf. How do you know it's done? Turn it over. Knock. He did. The loaf answered with a hollow sound. Ethan looked genuinely pleased. Abigail laughed before she could stop herself. Later, she told him about her grandmother, who had traveled west from Kentucky and believed people could taste the intention behind a meal. My grandmother said food remembers whether you cared while making it. Ethan turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands. My mother would have understood that. Abigail softened. Did she cook? Every day she was able. He looked toward the window. She's been gone 12 years. I'm sorry. A long silence settled between them. Then Ethan looked back at Abigail. She'd have liked you. He said it simply. No flirtation, no attempt to see what effect it had. That somehow made it worse. After he left, Abigail remained beside the work table with flour covering her hands. She reminded herself that Ethan Walker was engaged. She reminded herself that she was here for $40. She reminded herself about the mortgage, the leaking roof, Daniel's 40 acres. Then the kitchen door opened. Charlotte entered carrying a large sheet of paper. The cake design arrived from St. Louis. She spread it across Abigail's work table. 6 delicate tiers rose beneath elaborate spun sugar columns. Abigail studied the drawing. Then she looked toward the brightening Wyoming sky outside the window and thought about July heat. Those columns would never hold. You'll follow it exactly, Charlotte said. Abigail looked down at the impossible cake. For 6 years, silence had helped her survive. For the first time, she wondered whether silence might ruin the very thing she had come here to save. Abigail studied the drawing again. The cake was beautiful on paper. 6 narrow tiers, spun sugar columns, glass-like curls around the edges. It belonged in the window of some St. Louis confectioner where summer heat could be kept outside. Not in a Wyoming ranch house in July. This won't hold, Abigail said. Charlotte's expression changed. I beg your pardon. The upper tiers are too heavy for those columns. Once the room warms, the sugar will soften. Then keep the room cool. With 2 ranges burning and food for 200 people, Charlotte folded her gloves against one palm. I didn't hire you to explain why something cannot be done. Abigail felt the old instinct rise in her. Lower your eyes. Finish the job. Take the $40 home. Instead, she placed one flour-covered finger on the drawing. If I build this exactly as shown, there is a fair chance it falls before your guests ever taste it. Charlotte's gaze hardened. You would do well to remember what you are in this house. Abigail slowly lifted her eyes. I know exactly what I am. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them. I am the woman responsible for feeding 200 people on your wedding day. If my name is never spoken beyond that door, so be it. But what leaves this kitchen will be right. Charlotte stared at her. Abigail pulled one of her own sketches from beneath the ledger. 4 solid tiers, climbing roses, sweet peas worked around the edges. I can give you this, it'll stand, and it'll be finer than something built only to look expensive. Charlotte did not touch the sketch. You're very certain of yourself. About this, yes. A floorboard creaked near the back porch. Charlotte glanced toward the sound, but no one stood in the doorway. 4 tiers, she said finally, and it had better be worth looking at. She gathered the St. Louis drawing and left. Abigail waited until the latch settled. Then Ethan's voice came from outside. "You handled that better than I would have." He stepped through the back doorway, hat in hand. "How much did you hear?" "Enough." His jaw was tight. "She shouldn't speak to you that way. Please don't make trouble over it." "Abigail, I need this job." That stopped him. She wiped her hands on her apron. "If you quarrel with your future wife because of me, I still have to work under this roof tomorrow morning." Ethan looked toward the door Charlotte had used. "All right." He didn't sound pleased. Then his attention fell on Abigail's sketch. "This yours?" "Yes." He studied the roses. "Don't change it." She looked at him. "The cake? That one is right the way it is." His eyes met hers for one quiet second. "And whatever arrangement Charlotte made with you, you ought to know something. You're not invisible in this house." He paused. "Not to me." Then he put on his hat and walked outside. That night, Abigail lay on the narrow cot behind the pantry, listening to crickets beyond the screen. "Not to me." She turned onto her other side. At 5 the next morning, she had already poured 2 cups before Ethan entered. Neither mentioned it. Days began gathering around that hour. Ethan came in after checking cattle with mud dried along his boots. Abigail wrapped warm bread in cloth and pushed it toward him. "For the range. You trying to improve my disposition?" "I've seen your disposition before breakfast. I'm protecting the ranch hands." He laughed. Another morning, the cold cellar door caught against its lower hinge. Abigail returned from the smokehouse to find Ethan kneeling beside it with a screwdriver and a small tin of grease. "You don't have to do that." "I know." That answer stayed with her longer than it should have. Then Charlotte began appearing before breakfast, once for the menu, once because Ethan was supposedly needed at the North Corral, once with a message that railroad representatives would arrive later in the month. She never mentioned the 2 coffee cups. She didn't need to. The argument came 3 mornings later. Abigail was rolling pastry when voices carried through the corridor. "You spend every morning in there." "I drink coffee." "With her." A pause. Then Charlotte again. "She was hired to cook, Ethan. She has a struggling farm and no place in the life we're building. When the wedding is over, she'll disappear back where she came from." Abigail's rolling pin stopped. Charlotte continued quieter now. "You cannot possibly be confused about what she is." Ethan answered so softly Abigail almost missed it. "Don't speak about her that way again." "Excuse me?" "You heard me." A door closed. No slam, just a latch settling into place. The following morning, Ethan came at 5 as usual. He poured coffee but remained standing. "You heard yesterday." Abigail kept shaping biscuits. "Yes." "I'm sorry." "You don't owe me an apology." "Maybe I owe you one for letting it reach that point." She looked up. "I need this job, Ethan." It was the first time his name had nearly come naturally. She caught herself and looked away. "I need things simple." He watched her for a moment. "Simple," he said. Their hands reached for the sugar bowl at the same time. Both stopped. Abigail withdrew hers first. By noon, Eleanor Beaumont arrived from St. Louis. She inspected the kitchen, Abigail, and finally the revised cake sketch with equal suspicion. "This is not what Charlotte selected. The other design won't survive the heat. We are paying for what was requested." "Mother." Charlotte stood in the doorway. Everyone turned. For several seconds, she looked at Abigail's drawing. Then she said, "She's right about the heat." Eleanor's surprise was almost worth the morning. Charlotte left without another word. 2 days later, 3 strangers came through the main gate in a polished wagon. Their coats were too clean for cattlemen. One carried a leather document case. Another had survey maps rolled beneath his arm. Abigail watched from the kitchen window as Ethan came out of the barn. He saw the men. Whatever ease had lived in his face at 5 that morning disappeared. They spoke briefly before riding east, toward the best grazing ground on Walker Ranch. That evening, May entered the kitchen, closed the door behind herself, and sat at Abigail's work table. She didn't ask for coffee. That worried Abigail more than anything. "Those men weren't wedding guests," May said. "I gathered that." May looked toward the corridor before lowering her voice. "The Beaumonts have wanted Ethan's eastern acres for 2 years. Railroad wants a straight passage through them." Abigail stopped wiping the table. Outside, somewhere beyond the corrals, a horse called into the dusk. May folded her hands. "I think you ought to understand something before this wedding gets any closer." Abigail waited. May looked her directly in the eye. "Marriage may not be the only promise the Beaumont family expects Ethan Walker to keep." Abigail did not answer at once. The kitchen had gone quiet around them. The evening fire had burned low. Outside, the last light was fading over the corrals, turning the dust copper and the fence rails black. May leaned forward. "Charlotte's father has been after those eastern acres for 2 years. Railroad men want a straight cut through the valley, and Ethan's land is the cleanest route." Abigail thought of the 3 men with survey maps. The wedding is part of it? I don't know how much was said plain and how much was understood." May rubbed one thumb across the rim of her cup. "But men don't ride out here carrying maps 3 weeks before a wedding unless they expect something." Abigail looked toward the east window. She had heard Ethan talk about that range before. Not proudly, not possessively, the way people spoke about ground that had fed them through bad years. The next morning he came in later than usual, 5:15. His boots were muddy and his coffee stayed untouched. Abigail worked a biscuit cutter through the dough once, twice, then set it down. "You don't have to tell me anything." "I know. But if you need somewhere to say it, this room is quiet." His eyes lifted to hers. For a long while he said nothing. Then, "They want the eastern grass." She waited. "Charlotte says it's reasonable. Railroad pays well. Her father says I'd be foolish to hold cattle ground when I can turn it into cash." He gave a dry little laugh that held no humor. "Says land is land." Abigail's hand rested flat on the table. "Is it?" Ethan looked at her. "No." That one word changed the room. "My father bought those acres before I was born," he said. "Dry years, that grass stayed green longer than the rest. First winter after my mother died, we nearly lost half the herd. Eastern pasture carried us through." Abigail understood that kind of memory. "Daniel's 40 acres aren't much," she said. "But every post out there was driven by somebody who expected to stay." Ethan nodded. "My father used to say the worst decisions a man makes are the ones he makes to keep from disappointing other people." "He sounds like a man worth listening to." He was. "And are you?" His mouth tightened. "That's the question." The wedding was 3 weeks away. Invitations had gone to Red Willow, Laramie, Cheyenne, and farther east. Charlotte's relatives filled the guest rooms. Railroad men came and went. Papers appeared on desks and disappeared into leather cases. Abigail said nothing about what Ethan should do. That mattered. She gave him coffee. She gave him quiet. She went back to her work. The pressure showed itself in other ways. Charlotte appeared twice in the kitchen, before noon one day, then again after supper. She changed the order of 2 dishes, changed it back, questioned the placement of the cake table, then stood watching Abigail press sugar pedals until Abigail finally asked whether something was wrong. "No." Charlotte's answer came too quickly. Later that week, Abigail was carrying jars toward the cellar when voices drifted from the back porch. Charlotte was there with 2 visiting women. "The cook is good," one said. "She is," Charlotte answered. Abigail stopped on the lower step. Very capable. Very local. The women laughed softly. Charlotte went on. She understands her place, which is more useful than talent sometimes. Another voice asked something Abigail could not hear. Charlotte answered, lighter now. She has no prospects beyond her little farm, no reason to imagine anything else. Abigail stood with a crate of preserves against her hip. For a moment she closed her eyes. Then she carried the jars downstairs. She did not confront Charlotte. She did not tell Ethan. She began the wedding feast again in her head from first course to last. If they wanted to keep her behind a door, fine. But every plate that passed through that door would carry her work. The final week became a blur of heat, smoke, and measured time. Hams came down from curing. Stock reduced overnight. 14 pies cooled on cellar shelves. Abigail pressed climbing roses and pale sweet peas one petal at a time, setting them across the 4-tier cake she had designed herself. On the morning of July 14th, Charlotte entered the kitchen already dressed for the luncheon in ivory silk. She stopped when she saw the cake. For the first time in 6 weeks, she had no immediate criticism. Her eyes moved slowly over the flowers. It's beautiful. The words seemed to surprise even her. Abigail looked at her. Thank you. Charlotte's expression closed again. Service begins at noon. She left. Abigail watched the door settle shut. By 10, wagons were lined along the south road. By 11, the ranch yard was full. Men in dark coats, women in summer dresses, cattlemen, merchants, railroad representatives, families from neighboring spreads. 200 voices layered over fiddle music and the rattle of dishes. The final vows were set for late afternoon. The Beaumonts had planned a grand luncheon first. Abigail never saw the tables. She saw only the plates going out, then coming back empty. Praise returned in scraps. Best ham I've had in 30 years. Who made that bread? Tell whoever baked those pies I want the recipe. Nobody came for her name. At last, the cake left the kitchen. May and 2 ranch hands carried it through the corridor. A sound rose from the banquet hall. Not laughter, admiration. Abigail stood alone beside the cold stove. She had been awake since before 2. For the first time all day, she sat down. The room seemed to tilt at the edges. She closed her eyes. Then Charlotte's voice carried through the wall. Bright, clear, trained for a room. So many of you have asked about the extraordinary meal today, she said. Abigail opened her eyes. Charlotte continued. And I think you deserve to know the truth. Abigail sat very still beside the cold stove. In the banquet hall, chairs creaked. Someone laughed softly before Charlotte had even reached the point. We did hire a local woman to handle much of the cooking, Charlotte said. She is hard-working, capable certainly. But the menu, the standards, the presentation, that required direction. A few voices murmured agreement. Abigail looked at her hands. Flour still lived in the lines of her knuckles. Charlotte went on. She is a widow from outside Red Willow. Plain sort of woman. Stout. No polish to speak of. Her ambitions don't reach much farther than a kitchen, but I suppose that is useful in its own way. The laughter came this time. Not everyone. Enough. Then Charlotte gave the small, practiced sigh. Bless her heart. Abigail stood. No tears came. She removed her apron, folded it once, and placed it on the work table. Her knives went back into their cloth roll. Her mother's skillet came down from the hook and was wrapped in the old towel she had brought from home. May came through the corridor door, pale with anger. Abigail, I'm leaving. You don't have to leave like this. Yes, Abigail said. I do. The back door opened. Ethan stepped inside. He was dressed for the ceremony. Dark coat, clean white shirt, silver watch chain at his vest. He looked wrong in those clothes now, as if they belonged to a decision he had already outgrown. His eyes went to the packed skillet. You're leaving. I'm finished. What she said in there is your concern, not mine. His jaw tightened. It became my concern when she stood in front of 200 people and mocked the woman who made every plate they're eating. Abigail lifted the knife roll. She hired me to stay behind the door. I agreed. That doesn't make it right. No, but I knew the terms. Ethan took one step closer. Abigail, that's not what you are. She finally looked at him. What am I supposed to do with that today? He had no answer. Outside, fiddle music had stopped. Voices rolled low through the hall. Abigail moved toward the door. I can't go back in there, Ethan said. She stopped. For 6 weeks, she had called him Mr. Walker. Now the name came without permission. Ethan. He looked up sharply. You have to go back. I just told you I can't. You can. Her voice stayed quiet. I've watched you ride out in bad weather because cattle were down. I've seen you mend fence after dark because it had to be done. You don't get to hide in a kitchen because the thing waiting in that room is harder. His eyes held hers. What if the hard thing isn't in that room? Abigail's breath caught. For 1 second, neither moved. Then she opened the door. Go find out. She walked into the July heat. Behind her, Ethan stood alone. Then his footsteps turned toward the banquet hall. Abigail had reached the wagon road when his voice carried through the open windows. Charlotte. Everything inside went silent. She kept walking. At the edge of the property, May came hurrying after her, skirts gathered above the dust. He stopped it. Abigail turned. What? The wedding, before the vows. May caught her breath. He told Charlotte he would not marry a woman who measured people by their weight, their money, their name, or what use they could be to her. Abigail stared back toward the ranch house. May continued. And then her father brought up the Eastern Acres. What happened? Ethan said they were not for sale. The railroad arrangement had died in the same room as the wedding. By the time Abigail returned to the kitchen, guests were already gathering on the lawn in confused clusters. A wagon was being brought around for Eleanor Beaumont. 2 railroad men stood near the porch with rolled maps under their arms. Ethan was in the kitchen with his coat off and his sleeves rolled. He looked exhausted. I thought you'd gone. I almost did, he nodded. I was wrong about obligation, he said. I thought keeping a promise was the same as doing right. Abigail set her skillet down. And now I know better. The door opened again. Charlotte entered. Her hair had begun to come loose at one side. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. She looked at Abigail. What you made today was extraordinary. Abigail said nothing. Charlotte swallowed once. I knew that before I stood up. The admission seemed harder for her than anger had been. I knew what I was saying about you wasn't true. Silence settled across the kitchen. It did not forgive anything, but it was not nothing. Charlotte turned to Ethan. My father will make trouble over the land. I know. You were never going to sell it. No. She nodded once, then she left. Outside, carriage wheels began turning toward the road. Ethan looked at Abigail across the work table. I didn't end that engagement because she insulted you. Abigail waited. I ended it because I spent 6 weeks learning the difference between a life that looked proper and a life that felt honest. His voice dropped. I'm not asking you for anything today. She picked up her knives. That's good. A faint sadness moved across his face. I just needed you to know. Abigail held his gaze. I know now. Then she went home alone. 11 days later, she was on her own roof driving the last nail into new tin when a wagon appeared on the road. May climbed down holding a folded letter. Abigail wiped her hands on her skirt. News from Walker Ranch? May shook her head. No. She held out the envelope. This is for Abigail Carter. On the front, written in a stranger's careful hand, was her name. Not widow, not cook, not help, her name. Abigail opened the letter at her kitchen table while May poured coffee. A cattleman from Laramie had attended the Walker luncheon. He remembered the smoked ham, the bread, and especially the pies. He was hosting 60 members of a cattlemen's association in September. He wanted Abigail Carter to prepare the dinner. The amount offered was 3 times what Walker Ranch had paid her. Abigail read it again. You gave him my name? I did. Without asking. May lifted her cup. You can scold me after you accept. Abigail tried not to smile. She accepted that evening. Only afterward did she ask, How is Ethan? May's expression softened. Working, riding fence, checking cattle, eating breakfast alone. He hasn't asked about me? No. Something must have shown on Abigail's face because May added, That isn't the same as forgetting you. He's giving you room. After May left, Abigail carried the old tin bucket from the bedroom and set it in the shed. The new roof held. The land was still hers. And now somebody beyond Red Willow knew her name because of something she had made. That night she wrote a second letter. I believe I left something in your kitchen. I'd like to come by Thursday morning. A. Carter. Thursday arrived gray and cool. Abigail reached Walker Ranch at 5. The kitchen door was unlocked. A coffee pot rested on the stove. Beside it stood 1 cup and a folded note. I looked everywhere. Couldn't find what you left. Abigail was still smiling at it when the door opened. Ethan entered wearing dusty boots and a faded work shirt. Morning. Morning. He noticed the note in her hand. So what did you leave? Abigail set it down. I don't think it was something you could find by looking. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Ethan rested both hands against the work table. I owe you the truth. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. He told her the engagement had felt wrong before she ever came to Walker Ranch. He had stayed because it seemed practical, because families were involved, because promises had been made. Then Abigail came. Every morning I walked through that door and things made sense for an hour. His eyes stayed on hers. You talked about bread like it mattered, land like it remembered people. Your grandmother, Daniel, work. I kept coming back because this was the only place I wasn't pretending. Abigail's fingers tightened around the note. What are you asking me? Nothing yet. He came around the table but stopped several feet away. I'm telling you where I stand, so you can decide knowing the truth. Abigail looked down. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. I've spent most of my life being useful, Ethan. Useful isn't the same as being chosen. He did not rush to answer. That was one reason she believed him when he finally did. I can't undo that in one morning. I can only tell you the truth today and do the same tomorrow. Abigail looked at him. I got another job. His eyebrows rose. Laramie, 60 cattlemen. Then he smiled. Not proudly, as though he had caused it, simply pleased. How many ovens? The question caught her off guard. 2, maybe 3. Serving all 60 at once? 2 sittings if the room allows it. How far are you hauling the pies? And just like that, he was listening again. Abigail poured the coffee. This time she did not sit at the opposite end of the table. She sat beside him. 3 weeks passed. Ethan came to her homestead, but never without invitation. He helped rehang the south gate after asking first. He ate supper at Abigail's table. He listened while she planned the Laramie dinner, and never once offered to take over the expense or tell her how her business ought to be run. One evening, they finished the gate near sundown. The Wyoming sky had turned gold beyond the ridge. Ethan stayed on the porch after supper. Abigail stood beside the rail. I need to ask you something. Ask. Are you sure this isn't because of Charlotte? He said nothing. Or because the wedding ended and the house got quiet? No. How can you know? Ethan stepped closer. He held out his hand. He did not take hers. Abigail looked at it. Then she placed her hand in his. Only when her fingers closed did Ethan speak. This didn't begin when I stopped that wedding. His thumb rested lightly against her knuckles. It began every morning. I found myself riding back early because I knew you'd be in that kitchen. Abigail's eyes lifted to his. I kept telling myself it was coffee. A small smile touched his face. It wasn't. The evening wind moved through the grass. It's always been you. Abigail stood very still. Then she squeezed his hand. Yes. They married in October on Abigail's 40 acres. No railroad men came. No society crowd filled the yard. May stood near the minister with tears already on her face. Neighbors gathered beside the straight-hanging south gate. 2 cattlemen from Laramie came too, men who now greeted Abigail by name. She wore her best blue dress. Beneath it, tied quietly at her waist, was her mother's apron. The roof behind her no longer leaked. Another cooking inquiry sat unanswered on her kitchen table. Walker Ranch still held its eastern grass. Abigail still held Daniel's 40 acres. Nothing had been traded for love. When the minister finished, Ethan took both her hands. He leaned close. She'd have liked you very much. Abigail knew exactly who he meant. His mother. The woman they had spoken of across coffee in the 5 o'clock light. Abigail looked beyond him toward her farmhouse and the wide Wyoming country opening behind it. Months earlier, she had stood behind a closed kitchen door while strangers laughed at a woman whose name they did not know. There was no door in front of her now, only open land, her land. Her work would travel farther than she ever had. Her name would go with it. And beside her stood a cowboy who had never asked her to become smaller so he could love her. Ethan squeezed her hand. Abigail squeezed back. Then they turned together toward home. Maybe that was the quiet miracle of Abigail Carter's story. She had spent years believing survival meant asking for little, carrying her burdens alone, and never expecting anyone to see beyond what she could do for them. Yet the life waiting for her was not built by becoming someone else. It began when she refused to surrender the land beneath her feet, the work in her hands, or the dignity she had carried through every lonely season. And Ethan did not rescue her. He simply learned to stand beside her. If you had been Abigail, standing behind that kitchen door while strangers laughed, would you have walked away for good? Or would you have found the courage when the time was right to trust someone again? Tell me in the comments. I'd truly like to know. Sometimes a second chance does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it looks like a repaired roof after years of rain, a gate hanging straight again, 2 cups of coffee at 5 in the morning, a hand offered without pressure, waiting patiently for another hand to choose it. Perhaps that is what real love asks of us, not to disappear inside another person's life, but to bring our whole life with us and find someone willing to walk beside it. If stories about ordinary people finding dignity, healing, and unexpected love still mean something to you, you're welcome to subscribe. There are more journeys waiting beyond the next ridge, some mysterious, some heartbreaking, and some that may leave a little light behind. And for Abigail and Ethan, that October road led only one direction: home.